On this beach in 1896, a mystery washed up on the shore that would remain unsolved for nearly 100 years. This is the story of
the St. Augustine sea monster.
This mystery centered around the arrival of a strange blob found by two local boys biking on Anastasia Island's beaches in St. Augustine, Florida. On November 30th, 1896, the two boys found what appeared to be a corpse of a massive unidentified sea creature. They would then report their find to the founder of the St. Augustine Historical and Scientific Societies,
Dr. DeWitt Webb.
Dr. Webb would return the very next morning, on December 1st, 1896, to examine the report in person. What he saw baffles the scientist. He described the blob as an enormous sea creature in an advanced state of decomposition. He further details the mass as being a combination of the colors pink, white, and silver, with some areas even reflecting under the Florida sun. Despite being slightly buried by the sand and wind, he measured the mass to be 18 feet long and 7 feet wide, while at the same time bearing several strange appendages, which he theorized to be former tentacles of immense size. Webb stated the creature was hard to cut into and must have weighed nearly 5 tons. After a day of analyzing the remains, he deduced the blob to be the remnants of an undiscovered species of gigantic octopus. The doctor, realizing this might be the only known specimen of such a creature ever found, he began excavating the remains fully from the sand and sought the help of two local photographers to take pictures to preserve the blob. On December 7th, 1896, the photographers would capture the only known photographs of the St. Augustine sea monster. The first set of photos would be sent directly to the head of the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, Dr. Joel Allen. However, Allen would never respond. The second set of photos would be lost to time. Until, in 1993, a woman in California would find the lost set of photographs after hearing the story and recognizing the old pictures. After the monster sighting in St. Augustine, the strange occurrence began of blobs appearing on shorelines all around the world, all bearing similar descriptions and immense scale. These strange blobs gained the name lobsters. After the story spread through the town, the state, and the nation, locals would begin to submit their personal accounts of the monster to various big city newspapers. The most notable was the account by the owner of the only hotel on Anastasia Island at this time,
Dr. George Grant.
On December 13th, Grant submitted a rather exaggerated account of the creature to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1896. This overly imagined retelling was likely an attempt by Grant to increase patronage to his hotel, and it would work brilliantly. Soon, every large newspaper in the country was running a story on the St. Augustine sea monster. On January 1st, 1897, Webb's letter was finally read, unexpectedly, not by the man who he originally sent the photos to, but rather
Professor Addison Verrill
at Yale University, who also happened to be the preeminent cephalopod expert in the nation. That same day, Verrill officially responded to Webb's account in the January issue of the American Journal for Science, where he stated, based on the description and photos, he concluded this most likely to be that of a giant squid. 2 days later, he would revoke this and identified the blob as an undiscovered giant octopus species. Despite all this, the weather was still blind to the possibility of discovery, and since nobody had moved the specimen yet, once a storm hit on January 9, 1897, the globster was lost to the seas again. Thankfully though, on January 15th, the tide would bring the corpse back to Anastasia Island, this time only 2 miles south of its original location, near the present-day state park. A few days later, it is moved further inland into the dunes so as to not lose the monster again. With this, the story kept growing, and more tourists came to visit the now rotting mass. Soon, Verrill's first identification of a giant squid reached the town through the local newspaper, The Tatler. Upon seeing this, Verrill publishes an update to the American Journal for Science, this time naming the giant octopus species, which he called Octopus giganteus. Upon request, Webb sent Verrill a preserved specimen of the globster, and on February 23, 1897, Verrill finally examined the remnant and concluded it most likely to be a fragment of a whale's jaw, but he could not say for certain. Despite Verrill's final identification, the story had already reached sea to sea, and the biggest attraction of the town was the mysterious remains of a possible undiscovered gigantic octopus species. Due to this influx of tourists, Dr. Grant, the local hotel owner, would move the several-ton monster a mile inland. With the help of 6 horses, they dragged the mass all the way to the front of his hotel, at the end of the railroad. Grant would begin charging fees to see the beast, with thousands traveling to the city to see it. Although, as time faded, so would the story and the strange mystery of a giant unknown species washing ashore in St. Augustine, Florida, became a tall tale. It is currently unknown what happened to the remains or where they ended up in the end. The years go by and the story fades into obscurity. Until in 1957, an employee working at Marineland read a newspaper article describing the
Facts about Florida.
One fact included was the strange tale of an undiscovered gigantic octopus washing up on Anastasia Island in 1896. This led him to do further research on the topic, and he noticed the sample sent to Verrill was still intact and preserved at the Smithsonian. He immediately contacts the museum and asks if it would be possible he could send the sample to his friend at the University of Florida to test the flesh with a modern electronic microscope. Several years later, the Smithsonian finally agreed, and in 1971, nearly 100 years after it washed ashore, the monster would finally be tested with modern equipment. This study actually found the sample to be that of an octopus, agreeing with Verrill's second and most famous identification. Later in 1986, the University of Chicago would also test the sample, though this time with a hopefully more accurate amino acid test. This test would concur with 1971's, finding it to be also a new species of octopus, further emboldening the tale. Nearly a decade later, at the height of the mystery's popularity, the flesh would be tested a third time. In 1995, an experiment would be conducted to combine the amino acid identification with the electron microscope findings. This far more accurate experiment concluded the specimen to be nothing more than whale blubber, and agreed with Verrill's final conclusion of it being a whale's jaw.
In 2005,
This finding would spurn the testing of all globsters from the era that appeared and had their samples survive to this day, and all were found to be definitively blubber from a whale, officially ending the globster mystery for good. Despite the fact the St. Augustine monster turned out to be no monster at all, this does not mean such a species is still out there, waiting to be found.